at 1007 hours on the morning of June 19, 1944.
A fighter direction officer sat inside the dimly lit Combat Information Center aboard USS Lexington, watching pale green phosphorescent contacts drift across his radar display 130 miles west of the task force.
69 Japanese aircraft were flying directly toward Task Force 58.
The radar scope revealed the entire situation, the enemy formation, the American carriers, and the wide stretch of empty ocean separating them. Within the next 12 minutes, fighter directors throughout the task force would need to coordinate the interception of those 69 hostile aircraft using dozens of Grumman F6F Hellcat fighters dispersed across 3 altitude layers and separated by miles of open Philippine Sea airspace. The Americans possessed something the Japanese were unaware even existed, a technological edge so decisive that the events of the next 17 minutes would permanently alter naval air warfare. Japanese pilots launched from 9 carriers that morning believing they were executing conventional strike missions against the American fleet. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa's initial attack wave consisted of 69 aircraft, including Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters, Yokosuka D4Y dive bombers, and Nakajima B6N torpedo planes. The operational plan was straightforward: locate the American carriers, attack from altitude, and sink as many ships as possible. The Americans fielded 15 carriers. Japan needed to destroy at least 5 to regain the strategic balance. Japanese aviators understood that American aircraft were rugged and American pilots capable, but they expected to visually detect American fighters before engagement.
They were mistaken.
At that very moment, every maneuver of their formation was being tracked by an SK-2 air search radar aboard the battleship Alabama, detected at a range of 150 miles, plotted on transparent vertical boards in multiple combat information centers across the task force, and analyzed by teams of radar operators, plotters, and fighter directors preparing to vector interceptors long before the raid approached the carriers.
Earlier that morning, at 0745, an act of personal bravery had temporarily delayed disaster for the Japanese fleet.
As the carrier Taiho launched her second strike, USS Albacore fired 6 torpedoes at the flagship. Warrant Officer Seikio Komatsu, a strike pilot who had just departed in his Yokosuka D4Y dive bomber, spotted a torpedo wake racing toward his carrier. Breaking formation, he dove directly into the torpedo's path and deliberately collided with it.
The weapon detonated. Komatsu was killed instantly.
His sacrifice destroyed 1 torpedo, but the remaining 5 continued toward Taiho.
4 missed. The 6th slammed into the carrier's starboard side, rupturing aviation fuel tanks and jamming the forward elevator. Initial damage appeared manageable, and Taiho continued flight operations. However, leaking fuel lines filled the ship with volatile vapors. The carrier had become a floating bomb waiting to explode. Komatsu's heroism delayed the inevitable by hours, but could not prevent it. The first major test of American radar-directed fighter defense had occurred on June 11, 1944. Task Force 58 launched a massive strike against Saipan. 208 fighters and 8 torpedo bombers attacked Japanese positions across the island. American pilots claimed 86 aerial victories and destroyed an additional 33 aircraft on the ground. Japanese interceptors attempting to engage the strike encountered Hellcats waiting at exact altitudes and headings, not by chance or luck, but through radar detection and coordinated vectoring from combat information centers aboard multiple carriers. Japanese pilots reported that American fighters seemed to appear out of nowhere, perfectly positioned for interception. Their commanders dismissed the reports as coincidence. They were wrong. American forces were tracking every Japanese aircraft from the moment it left the deck.
4 days later, on June 15 at dusk, Japanese forces launched a probing attack against Task Force 58. 7 torpedo aircraft attacked from Guam. American radar detected them at 80 miles.
Fighter directors vectored Hellcats to intercept.
6 of the 7 attackers were destroyed before reaching the carriers. The 7th turned back.
No American ships were hit.
Surviving Japanese pilots reported that American combat air patrols appeared to know precisely where they were coming from and at what altitude.
Japanese intelligence could not account for this phenomenon. Reconnaissance had shown no American fighters in the interception zone, yet the Hellcats appeared exactly where needed. What the Japanese failed to understand was that they were no longer fighting individual pilots. They were fighting a system. By mid-June 1944, the Combat Information Center had become the operational nerve center of American carrier warfare. The concept had evolved from harsh lessons learned in 1942. At the Battle of Midway, American carriers had fought nearly blind. Radar existed but was crude.
Intership communication was disorganized.
Fighter direction relied on visual sightings and guesswork. Carriers burned because defensive fighters could not be positioned effectively. After Midway, the Navy recognized the need for a fundamentally better system.
Admiral Chester Nimitz's staff examined the problem closely. They studied British experience with radar-directed fighter control, analyzed communication breakdowns, and developed new procedures. In November 1942, the Pacific Fleet issued Tactical Bulletin 4TB42, establishing standardized fighter direction doctrine. In January 1943, Admiral Ernest King formally designated the Coordination Center the Combat Information Center. By early 1944, every new carrier included a dedicated CIC staffed by trained specialists. The system functioned through integration. Multiple ships equipped with SK-2 air search radars detected incoming raids at ranges up to 150 miles. Radar returns appeared on circular scopes with rotating sweep lines. Operators called out bearing and distance. Enlisted plotters marked contacts on large transparent vertical boards using grease pencils, different colors for different raid types. Numbers identified each formation. Raid 1. Raid 2. Raid 3. The plot displayed everything: enemy aircraft, friendly fighters, surface ships, all visible simultaneously. The fighter direction officer stood behind the plotters, observing the entire tactical picture in real time. He maintained radio contact with every Hellcat airborne. VHF radios provided clear, reliable communication across multiple frequencies. He could track the fighters, monitor incoming raids, calculate interception geometry, altitudes, and timing, then transmit precise instructions. Turn left heading 270. Climb to Angels 18. Bogey bearing 295. Range 60 miles. The fighters acknowledged and maneuvered. The plot updated. The interception unfolded. Japanese aircraft flew directly into carefully positioned traps they never realized existed. The problem was not that Japanese pilots lacked skill or doctrine. Japanese naval aviation emphasized altitude attacks, speed, and coordinated strikes, tactics that had worked for 2 years. But that doctrine assumed both sides were effectively blind. It assumed approach to visual range without detection. It assumed randomly positioned enemy patrols. Those assumptions had been valid in 1942 at Coral Sea, Midway, and Santa Cruz. By June 1944, they were obsolete. The Americans were no longer guessing. They were detecting, calculating, and vectoring. And Japanese pilots were flying into precisely coordinated interceptions without ever understanding why. On the morning of June 19, the Japanese mobile fleet under Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa launched 4 massive strike waves against Task Force 58. Ozawa commanded 9 carriers and 430 carrier aircraft. He expected reinforcement from 300 land-based aircraft operating from Guam, Rota, and Tinian. He believed he possessed numerical superiority. He believed his aircraft's greater range would allow attacks from 200 miles, beyond American reach. He believed he could strike, land on Guam to refuel and rearm, then shuttle back to his carriers. He believed American defenses would be overwhelmed by simultaneous multi-axis attacks. Every one of those assumptions was wrong. What Ozawa didn't know was that American submarines had already spotted his fleet. USS Flying Fish detected his carriers on June 15. USS Seahorse spotted his battleships the same day. USS Kavala tracked the fleet on June 17 and 18. American intelligence had broken Japanese operational codes. Admiral Raymond Spruant, commanding the Fifth Fleet, knew Ozawa was coming. Admiral Mark Mitcher, commanding Task Force 58 from the Lexington, prepared a coordinated defense that would destroy Japanese naval aviation in a single day. At 0700 hours on June 19, American radar operators detected Japanese aircraft forming up over Guam. At 0800 hours, a large formation was detected 80 miles southwest of the task force. At 1000 hours, the first major raid appeared on radar screens across the fleet. 69 aircraft, range 150 miles, bearing west, altitude unknown, but probably high, closing at 180 knots. Fighter directors designated at Raid 1. The task force fighter director aboard the Lexington coordinated with task group fighter directors across the fleet. Multiple carriers prepared to launch every available fighter. The system that had been developed over 2 years, refined through combat experience and perfected through training, was about to face its greatest test. The fighter direction officer in the Lexington CIC watched the plot develop. The Japanese formation appeared as a cluster of grease pencil marks on the transparent vertical board. 130 miles out, moving steadily east, Hellcats were already airborne on routine combat air patrol. More were being launched from every carrier in the task force. The fighter directors needed to position them 70 miles west at 18,000 feet to catch the Japanese at altitude before they could begin their attack dive. The Hellcats were scattered across 40 miles of ocean at various altitudes. Radio calls went out. Vectors assigned. Stand by 25. Turn right heading 280. Climb to Angels 18. Stand by 18. Maintain. Heading Angels 20. Stand by 34. Come left 265. The plot showed the Hellcats beginning to converge. 60 miles out. 55-50. The Japanese raid continued, closing 100 M9080. The intercept was developing. The timing was tight but workable. At 10:23, Admiral Mitcher ordered maximum fighter launch from all carriers. Every available Hellcat went into the air. Over 200 fighters, the sky filled with American aircraft, all coordinated, all vetoed, all positioned by fighter directors watching radar plots. More radio calls. The Japanese formation reached 70 miles range. The lead Hellcat division reported visual contact. Bandits high 12 o'clock. Large formation. The fighter director gave the command. Tally-ho, execute. The Hellcats dove in. The lead division hit the Japanese formation from above and ahead. Perfect position. The Japanese never saw them coming until Hellcats appeared in their midst. Zeros tried to turn and engage. Too late. The Hellcats were already through the formation, scattering it. More Hellcats arrived from other vectors, exactly where fighter directors had positioned them. The Japanese formation disintegrated. Individual aircraft tried to press attacks toward the carriers. Hellcats pursued and destroyed them one by one. Anti-aircraft fire from the screening battleships and cruisers created a wall of explosions at 12,000 feet. Japanese aircraft that penetrated the Hellcat screen flew into that wall. Very few survived. By 10:40, the engagement was over. 42 of 69 Japanese aircraft destroyed. 27 turned back or scattered. 0 hits on American carriers. 1 Hellcat shot down. The pilot was recovered by a destroyer. At 11:07, radar detected Raid 2, 109 aircraft, larger than Raid 1, coming from the northwest, range 120 miles. The task force fighter director assigned intercepts to multiple carriers. Essex took primary responsibility. Lexington supported. Bunker Hill launched additional fighters. The system repeated. Radar detection, plotting, vector assignment, intercept coordination. The Hellcats were already airborne from Raid 1. They reformed and repositioned based on new vectors, new altitude, new heading, new intercept point. Raid 2 approached. The Japanese formation flew straight. No evasive maneuvers. They maintained formation discipline exactly as doctrine prescribed, but doctrine assumed the enemy was blind. The Hellcats hit them. 60 miles out. 70 Japanese aircraft destroyed before the raid reached the American task force. The remainder scattered. For attacked the carriers. Near misses. Down. The second raid had been annihilated with even greater efficiency than the first. The third raid came at 1,300 hours. 47 aircraft from the north. Same pattern, detection, plotting, vectors, intercept. 7 Japanese aircraft shot down in the initial contact. The rest turned back without pressing the attack. Japanese pilots were beginning to understand they were flying into a trap they couldn't see and couldn't counter, but they had no way to communicate the nature of that trap to commanders who didn't understand radar-directed fighter control. The fourth raid launched between 1,000 and 11,3082 aircraft. This formation couldn't locate the American fleet. They circled, searched, burned fuel. Navigation errors compounded by combat stress. Eventually they headed for Guam to land and refuel. Fighter directors detected them on radar heading toward Erodi Field. Hellcats from the light carrier Kaupans were vetoed to intercept over Guam. 12 Hellcats from Kaupans joined, 7 from Essex and 8 from Hornet. 27 American fighters total. They arrived over Erodi Field as the Japanese were circling to land. Fuel low, defenses down, completely vulnerable. The American Fighters tore into them. 30 Japanese aircraft shot down over the field. 19
landed but were damaged by strafing runs. 0 effective aircraft remaining from that raid.
By 1600 hours, the battle was over. Japanese losses for June 19 exceeded 346 carrier aircraft destroyed.
American losses were 30 aircraft.
The statistical disparity was unprecedented. Japanese naval aviation had suffered a defeat so complete that it would never recover.
The carrier force that had attacked Pearl Harbor, that had terrorized the Pacific for 2 years, was effectively finished.
Not because American pilots were better trained, though they were. Not because American aircraft were superior, though they were, but because the Americans had
built a system that integrated radar detection, coordinated communication, and precise fighter direction into a
seamless defensive network that Japanese pilots couldn't penetrate and Japanese commanders couldn't understand.
The statistics told the story, but the statistics didn't capture what had actually happened.
Japanese pilots had
launched that morning, believing they were attacking an enemy who fought the same way they did.
Visual sighting,
individual initiative, pilot skill against pilot skill.
Instead, they had
encountered something completely different. A coordinated defense system that saw them coming from 150 miles away,
calculated their course and altitude with mathematical precision, positioned interceptors perfectly, and destroyed
them in carefully orchestrated engagements that left no room for individual skill to compensate.
It wasn't a fair fight. It was systematic execution. What the Japanese pilots didn't see was the Combat Information Center. They didn't see the radar operators watching green blips on circular screens. They didn't see the enlisted plotters marking transparent boards with grease pencils.
They didn't see the fighter directors with radio microphones issuing comvectors to Hellcat pilots. They didn't see teams of sailors working together with rehearsed precision.
They only saw the result: Hellcats appearing
from perfect positions every single time. No matter how they maneuvered, no matter how they approached, the Americans were always ready, always positioned, always waiting.
Japanese pilots reported this to their commanders. The Americans must have new radar.
The Americans must have broken
our codes.
The Americans must have spies on our carriers.
The reports were partially correct. The Americans did have excellent radar.
They had broken Japanese codes,
but those weren't the decisive factors.
The decisive factor was integration.
The Americans had taken
detection technology, communication systems, plotting techniques, and fighter direction doctrine and integrated them into a coordinated system that functioned as a single weapon.
The Japanese had most of the same components.
They had radar, Type 2 air search radar with 50 miles range and
5-degree bearing error.
They had radio communication. They had skilled pilots and experienced commanders.
What they lacked was integration. Japanese carriers operated independently.
Each ship tracked its own radar contacts and directed its own fighters.
There was
no unified picture, no coordinated vectors, no systematic approach. Japanese fighter direction remained intuitive and individual rather than systematic and coordinated. By the time Japanese engineers understood what the Americans had built, it was too late to respond.
The
industrial capacity to develop a comparable system didn't exist.
The trained personnel to operate it were dead. The time to implement it had run out. Japan was losing the war. The
Combat Information Center concept had been developed through institutional effort across the United States Navy.
After the Battle of Midway exposed critical weaknesses in carrier defense, multiple officers and technical experts
worked to solve the problem.
Radar specialists improved detection capabilities. Communications officers developed better radio procedures. Tactical experts designed fighter direction doctrine.
Training officers created standardized operating procedures. The system emerged from
collaboration among dozens of contributors, each solving part of the puzzle. No single person invented the
CIC. It was engineered through systematic analysis of combat failures
and methodical development of solutions. Lieutenant Commander John Montserrat was one of the first fighter direction officers trained in the new system. He served aboard the light carrier Langley during the Battle of the Philippine Sea. In the Langley CIC, Montserrat coordinated fighter intercepts against Japanese raids throughout June 19. His experience that day and his observations of how the system performed under combat stress informed his later work documenting CIC procedures. After the war, Montserrat wrote technical papers and a memoir describing the evolution of radar-directed fighter control. His 1985 book, Angel on the Yardarm, provided detailed accounts of how CIC operations functioned during the Philippine Sea Battle. Montserrat made clear in his writing that the system's success came from teamwork among radar operators, plotters, and fighter directors working together with rehearsed precision. Individual skill mattered, but the system was what made that skill effective. The fighter directors who vetoed the intercepts on June 19 never received individual recognition. No medals, no commendations, no names in official reports. The citation for Task Force 58 mentioned radar-directed fighter interception as a key factor in the victory, but it credited the system, not individuals. The Navy wanted to keep the capability secret. If the Japanese understood exactly how CIC worked, they might develop countermeasures, so the details remained classified through the end of the war. Fighter directors continued their work without public recognition, training new operators, refining procedures, improving coordination. The war continued for 14 more months. Every carrier battle that followed used the same system. The Philippines campaign, Uoma, Okinawa. Every time American radar detected Japanese formations, combat information centers plotted them. Fighter directors vetoed Hellcats to intercept. The pattern repeated. The results were consistent. Japanese aircraft destroyed. American carriers protected. The superiority was absolute. The Japanese never developed an equivalent integrated system. They had the technology. They had intelligent engineers. They had combat experience. That should have revealed the problem. Organizational culture and institutional inertia prevented adaptation. Japanese doctrine emphasized individual initiative and fighting spirit. The idea of systematic coordination through centralized direction contradicted cultural values about warrior independence. Even when Japanese officers recognized the American advantage, they couldn't implement similar systems because the institutional structure to support them didn't exist. By the time some Japanese commanders understood what needed to change, Japan's carrier force had been destroyed, and the industrial base to build new systems had been bombed to rubble. The Battle of the Philippine Sea demonstrated conclusively that modern warfare had entered a new era. Technology alone didn't determine victory. The British had radar before the Americans. The Germans had excellent radio communication. The Japanese had skilled pilots and combat experience. What mattered was integration. The ability to combine multiple technologies and procedures into a coordinated system. The willingness to train personnel systematically rather than relying on individual brilliance. The institutional discipline to follow procedures under stress rather than improvising. These factors, more than any individual weapon or tactic, determined the outcome. After the war, the Combat Information Center concept became standard on every American warship. The procedures developed in 1942 through 1944 evolved into modern naval air defense networks. When the Navy developed the Aegis combat system in the 1970s and 80s, it built on the same foundational principles established during World War II. Radar detection, computer plotting, coordinated weapon assignment, systematic engagement. The technology advanced dramatically. Computers replaced grease pencils. Digital displays replaced transparent boards, but the underlying concept remained identical. Integrate detection, coordination, and execution into a seamless system. In 1958, a technical paper on naval air defense history noted that the success of the Combat Information Center proved that modern warfare required integration of detection, communication, and coordination capabilities. Individual
skill still mattered. Brave pilots, skilled radar operators, and experienced commanders all contributed to victory. But without the system to position those individuals effectively, skill alone wasn't enough. The side with better information and better coordination would always defeat the side with superior individual warriors fighting independently. The Battle of the Philippine Sea proved that principle. 69 Japanese aircraft in the first raid, 42 destroyed. 109 Japanese aircraft in the second raid, 70 destroyed. The mathematics were brutal. The Japanese were brave. They were skilled, they were experienced, but they were fighting a system they couldn't see and couldn't counter, and the other system destroyed them. The photograph exists in the Naval History and Heritage Command Archives. Taken inside the Combat Information Center of a carrier during operations off Saipan in June 1944, it shows several officers standing around a large transparent plotting board. Grease pencil marks visible on the glass. Radar scopes glowing in the background. The officers are studying the plot with intense concentration. No names are visible in the caption, just the location and date. USS Carrier, Combat Information Center, June 1944. Those nameless officers working with nameless radar operators and nameless plotters helped destroy Japanese naval aviation in a single day. Not through individual heroics, not through dramatic last stands, through systematic coordination, through practiced procedures, through integration of technology and doctrine into a weapon the enemy couldn't match. That's how innovation actually happens in war. Not through brilliant individuals working alone, but through institutions that identify problems, develop solutions, train personnel, and refine procedures through experience. The radar didn't invent itself. The plotting boards weren't designed by accident. The fighter direction doctrine didn't emerge spontaneously. Hundreds of people across multiple organizations spent years developing every piece of the system. Engineers designed better radars. Communications specialists developed reliable radio procedures. Tactical experts analyzed combat data and revised doctrine. Training officers created schools to teach new techniques. Maintenance crews kept equipment functioning under harsh conditions. Supply officers ensured spare parts reached forward areas. And on June 19, 1944, all those separate efforts came together in the Combat Information Centers of Task Force 58 and proved that systematic integration could defeat individual skill, no matter how brave or experienced the individual warriors might be. The Japanese learned this lesson too late. Vice Admiral Ozawa survived the battle. He commanded what remained of the Japanese carrier force through the rest of 1944. At the Battle of Later Gulf in October, he used his remaining carriers as decoys to lure American forces away from invasion beaches. The carriers had almost no aircraft, almost no experienced pilots. They were hollow shells serving as bait. American carriers destroyed them easily. Ozawa survived again. After the war, American interrogators asked him about the Battle of the Philippine Sea. What had gone wrong? Why had Japanese naval aviation collapsed so completely? Ozawa said the Americans had better aircraft and better trained pilots. That was true, but incomplete. The Americans also had a system, and Ozawa, for all his experience and tactical skill, had never understood how to fight against systematic coordination. His pilots had flown bravely. His plan had been sound according to Japanese doctrine, but doctrine written for individual combat in 1941 couldn't work against integrated system warfare in 1944. The gap was unbridgeable. Japanese pilots flew into that gap on the morning of June 19, believing they were flying normal strike missions, attack the Americans, sink some carriers, return to base. Some would die. That was expected, but most would survive. That was the normal ratio. Instead, 42 died from the first raid alone. 27 fled. 0 survived. To reach the American carriers and deliver attacks, the Japanese had courage. They had training. They had skill. What they didn't have was a system that could compete with American radar-directed fighter control. Warrant. Officer Seikyo Komatsu had already died that morning, sacrificing himself to stop a torpedo from hitting Taiho. His
Heroism represented the best of Japanese warrior spirit, but individual heroism, no matter how extraordinary, couldn't overcome systematic technological superiority. And on June 19, 1944, that deficiency cost Japan 346 aircraft and the war in the Pacific. That's the hardest lesson of modern warfare. Courage doesn't matter if you're fighting the wrong kind of fight. Training doesn't matter if your doctrine is obsolete. Skill doesn't matter if the enemy can see you coming and position forces to counter your every move. The Japanese had courage, they had training, they had skill. What they didn't have was a system that could compete with American radar-directed fighter control, and on June 19, 1944, that deficiency cost them 346 aircraft and the war in the Pacific. The submarine war that morning had already dealt devastating blows to Ozawa's fleet. At 0816, USS Baker fired a spread of 6 torpedoes at the carrier Taiho. Warrant Officer Seikyo Komatsu, who had just taken off, saw the torpedo wakes and deliberately crashed his aircraft into one torpedo's path, destroying it at the cost of his life. 4 other torpedoes missed, but the 6th torpedo struck Taiho on the starboard side. The damage seemed minor. Aviation fuel vapor began leaking from ruptured tanks into the hangar deck. A damage control officer ordered the ventilation system turned to maximum to clear the fumes. The decision was fatally wrong. Instead of venting the vapors overboard, the ventilation system spread them throughout the ship. At 3:28 that afternoon, a spark ignited the vapor. Taiho exploded from within. Secondary explosions ripped through the ship. The carrier that had seemed undamaged that morning became an inferno in minutes. She sank at 428 with 1650 crew members. 1,500 men died. At 11:118, USS Kavala fired torpedoes at the carrier Shokaku. 3 torpedoes struck the veteran carrier. Shokaku had participated in the Pearl Harbor attack. She had fought at Coral Sea, Santa Cruz, and a dozen other battles. She had survived bombs and torpedoes before, but this time the damage was catastrophic. Aviation fuel fires spread rapidly. Damage control couldn't contain them. 12:10, the captain ordered abandon ship. At 1,504, Shokaku exploded and sank. 887 crew members died. The carrier that had terrorized the Pacific for 2 years vanished beneath the waves in the same battle where American fighters destroyed her aircraft. The loss of 2 fleet carriers compounded the disaster of losing 346 aircraft. But the human cost was even more devastating. Japan had started the war with approximately 3,500 highly trained carrier pilots. By June 1944, fewer than 1,000 experienced pilots remained. The training program couldn't replace losses, fuel shortages, limited flight training. New pilots received 3 months of instruction where pre-war pilots had trained for 2 years. The quality gap was enormous. Experienced American pilots shot down inexperienced Japanese pilots with terrible efficiency. The Battle of the Philippine Sea destroyed what remained of Japan's experienced pilot corps. After June 19, Japanese carriers could barely man their remaining aircraft. Quality had collapsed along with quantity. The American victory came at minimal cost. 30 aircraft lost on June 19. Most pilots recovered by rescue operations. Task Force 58 suffered no damage to carriers. The screening battleships and cruisers took no hits. The anti-aircraft defenses functioned perfectly. The proximity-fused shells, a top-secret American weapon, detonated near aircraft rather than requiring direct hits. Japanese pilots flew into walls of exploding shells that tracked them through the sky. The combination of radar-directed fighters and proximity-fused anti-aircraft fire created a defense the Japanese couldn't penetrate. On June 20, American forces went on the offensive. Admiral Mitcher launched strikes against the retreating Japanese fleet. American pilots found Ozawa's carriers late in the afternoon. Long range, near the limit of Hellcat operational radius. Flyback in darkness with minimal fuel reserves. Mitcher approved the strike anyway. American aircraft attacked the Japanese fleet at sunset. They damaged several carriers and sank the fleet. Oiler Gino Maru, but the strike's timing forced American pilots to return in darkness. Many ran out of fuel, ditched at sea. Some crashed attempting night landings on carriers. The losses that night exceeded the losses from Japanese action on June 19. Mitchell made a controversial decision. He ordered every ship in the task force to turn on its lights, navigation lights, searchlights, signal lamps, anything to guide pilots home. The illumination made Task Force 58 visible for miles. Japanese submarines could have attacked, but Mitchell believed saving pilots mattered more than maintaining blackout. Discipline. Most pilots found carriers and landed safely. Rescue operations continued. Through the night, American destroyer crews plucked dozens of aviators from the water. The final count showed 20. American aircraft lost in combat on June 20, 80 lost to fuel exhaustion or landing accidents, but most of the air crew survived. American combat search and rescue was as systematic and effective as American air defense. The Battle of the Philippine Sea ended Japanese hopes of defeating the American advance through naval aviation. Admiral Somu Toyota, commander of the combined fleet, had planned Operation Ago as the decisive battle that would stop American momentum. He believed concentrating Japan's remaining carrier strength could inflict enough damage to force negotiated peace. The plan assumed rough par in aircraft numbers and pilot quality. Both assumptions were false. American carriers outnumbered Japanese carriers. American pilots had vastly superior training, and American technology integrated into systematic procedures gave the United States an overwhelming advantage. Toyota's plan collapsed in a single day. The political consequences in Japan were immediate. Prime Minister Hideki Tojo resigned on July 18, less than a month after the Philippine Sea disaster. His government had promised victory. The Battle of the Philippine Sea proved victory was impossible. Tojo's resignation didn't change Japan's strategic situation. The war continued, but the resignation signaled to informed observers that Japanese leadership recognized the war was lost. The question became how long Japan would continue fighting and how much destruction would occur before surrender. For the United States, the Battle of the Philippine Sea confirmed that the island-hopping strategy would succeed. American forces secured Saipan by July 9 despite fierce Japanese resistance. Tinian fell on August 1. Guam was recaptured by August 10. The Marianas provided bases for B-29 Superfortress bombers from Saipan and Tinian. American bombers could reach Tokyo. The strategic bombing campaign against Japan's home islands began in November 1944. The Marianas bases made that campaign possible, and American control of the Marianas was secured by the carrier battle that destroyed Japanese naval aviation on June 19. The technological lessons of the Philippine Sea battle influenced naval warfare for decades. After World War II, every navy recognized that radar-directed fighter control was essential for carrier operations. The Soviet Union studied American CIC procedures and developed similar systems. The British Royal Navy, which had pioneered some radar techniques before the Americans, refined its own coordination procedures. NATO standardized air defense procedures based on American wartime experience. Modern carrier battle groups use digital systems that process information thousands of times faster than 1944 technology, but the fundamental concept remains identical. Detect threats at maximum range, plot their position accurately, vector interceptors to engage before threats reach defended ships, coordinate all actions through centralized direction. The Combat Information Center of 1944 became the Combat Direction Center and then the Combat Information Center again. As terminology evolved, but the functions stayed constant. The radar systems themselves evolved dramatically. The SK-2 radar used at Philippine Sea operated at 290 MHz with 100 kilowatts of power. Maximum range of 150 miles required ideal conditions. The system was remarkable for 1944, but primitive compared to modern standards. Post-war radar development produced systems operating at higher
frequencies with vastly greater power and sensitivity. Digital signal processing replaced analog displays. Computer integration allowed automatic tracking of hundreds of targets simultaneously. The E-2 Hawkeye airborne early warning aircraft. Extended detection range to over 300 m. The Aegis system could track and engage multiple threats simultaneously with minimal human intervention. But all these advances built on the foundation established when 1944 engineers figured out how to integrate radar detection with fighter direction. The human element remained critical even as technology advanced. Radar operators in 1944 watched circular screens and called out contacts manually. Modern systems display information on high-resolution color screens with computer assistance. But operators still must interpret data, recognize patterns, and make decisions under stress. Fighter directors in 1944 issued vectors by voice radio. Modern controllers use data links and digital communication, but they still must coordinate multiple aircraft, prioritize threats, and manage complex engagements in real time. The technology assists human decision-making. It doesn't replace it. That lesson from Philippine Sea remains valid today. The battle also demonstrated the importance of training and doctrine. American success came partly from superior equipment, but mostly from superior preparation. Fighter directors trained for months before deploying to combat. They practiced with radar operators and plotters until the team functioned smoothly under pressure. Standard procedures meant every CIC followed the same methods. A fighter director could transfer between ships and immediately understand the system. Hellcat pilots trained to follow vectors precisely, trusting that controllers were positioning them correctly. The trust between controllers and pilots developed through repeated training exercises. When combat came, everyone knew their role. The system functioned because hundreds of people had practiced their parts until coordination became automatic. Japanese forces never achieved that level of systematic preparation. Individual Japanese pilots trained intensively in flying skills. Japanese tactics emphasized small unit coordination between 2 or 3 aircraft, but large-scale coordination between carriers, between ships and aircraft, between multiple groups of fighters never developed systematically. Each ship operated independently. AK commander made individual decisions. When American radar directed fighter control created a unified defense, Japanese forces couldn't respond effectively because they lacked the institutional structure to coordinate similar scale responses. The broader lesson applied beyond naval warfare. Modern military operations in any domain require integration of technology, training, and doctrine into coherent systems. Individual weapons, no matter how advanced, provide limited advantage if not integrated into coordinated employment. Individual soldiers, no matter how skilled, cannot match the effectiveness of trained units using systematic procedures. The same principles that made combat information centers effective in 1944 remain relevant to air operations, ground battles, cyber conflicts, and space missions today. Observe the battlefield clearly, synchronize forces efficiently, carry out operations methodically. These principles surpass specific technologies and continue to be essential to military success. The memorial at Saipan commemorates the Marines and soldiers who fought ashore during June and July 1944. 29,000 American casualties, including 3,500 killed. The ground fighting was intense. Every cave, every ridge, every structure had to be captured through infantry assaults against determined opposition. The Battle of the Philippine Sea is less widely known than the land combat, yet the carrier engagement made the terrestrial victory achievable. Had Japanese carrier aircraft reached the invasion beaches, assault forces would have endured significantly higher casualties. Had Japanese planes struck the supply ships, the operation might have failed. The combat information centers that neutralized Japanese naval aviation in a single day allowed American ground forces to secure the Marianas with uninterrupted naval and air support. Victory at sea enabled the hard-won victory on land. The personnel operating those combat information centers received little recognition beyond unit citations, no individual awards, no public acknowledgement. Most completed their service, left the Navy after the war, and returned to civilian life without ever explaining their contributions. Radar operators became electricians, plotters became draftsmen,
fighter directors became air traffic controllers or pursued entirely different careers. They were part of something revolutionary, yet saw it as merely performing their duties. The dramatic episodes of World War II, the fighter pilots, submarine crews, and marine assaults garnered attention and acclaim. The men in dimly lit rooms, monitoring radar screens and marking plotting boards, remained anonymous, yet their impact on victory was as vital as that of any combat pilot. They demonstrated that modern warfare demanded new types of warriors, not just courageous men facing danger, but technically trained specialists capable of operating complex systems under stress. The image of the warrior evolved in 1944, and this transformation has continued. The training pipeline for Combat Information Center personnel became one of the Navy's most rigorous programs. Schools at San Diego, Pearl Harbor, and Norfolk instructed radar operation, plotting techniques, and fighter direction. Courses lasted 3 months. Enlisted radar operators learned to identify various aircraft returns, estimate altitude from radar shadows, and differentiate true contacts from weather interference or false echoes. Plotters translated bearing and range data into precise marks on vertical boards, practicing speed and accuracy under time pressure. Fighter direction officers, always commissioned, learned to calculate intercept geometry, manage multiple fighter divisions concurrently, and maintain situational awareness during chaotic engagements. Training was demanding, with attrition rates exceeding 30%, but graduates emerged with unprecedented skills. The equipment itself represented significant engineering achievement for 1944. The SK-2 radar utilized a 20-foot rotating antenna mounted high on the carrier superstructure, transmitting radio pulses at 290 MHz. Reflected signals from aircraft produced bright spots on circular cathode ray tube displays. Bombers could be detected at 100 miles under favorable conditions, fighter-sized aircraft at 60 to 80 miles, depending on atmospheric conditions, antenna height, altitude, and operator skill. Constant maintenance was required. Vacuum tubes failed, salt spray corroded connections, tropical heat stressed electrical components. Radar technicians worked tirelessly. Carriers typically carried 2 to 3 technicians per major radar system. Their role was critical. A carrier with broken radar was nearly defenseless. The plotting boards used in combat information centers were marvels of simple yet effective technology. Large sheets of Herculite glass were mounted vertically, translucent so operators on both sides could see the marks, and durable enough for shipboard conditions. Plotters used colored grease pencils, red for enemy aircraft, blue for friendly fighters, green for unknown contacts. Marks were quickly wiped clean as raids ended and new ones began. Behind the board, operators maintained status displays showing which fighter divisions were airborne, fuel levels, and assigned patrol zones. Simple, visual, efficient, the entire system could be comprehended at a glance by anyone in the CIC. No digital displays, no electronic complexity, just glass, pencils, and trained personnel. The simplicity was strength, equipment that could be maintained and repaired by ship's crews using available materials, requiring no factory technicians. The technology matched the Navy's operational capabilities in forward combat areas thousands of miles from industrial support. Voice radio systems operated on very high-frequency channels between 200 and 300 MHz. Each carrier maintained multiple frequencies to prevent interference between fighter divisions. Radio operators relayed vectors from fighter directors, past fuel status updates, and coordinated landing patterns. Clear communication was vital. The Navy developed standardized radio procedures, standard phrases, standard position report formats, standard acknowledgments. Pilots and controllers spoke a shared procedural language, mundane but essential. Angels 18 meant 18,000 feet. Busters signaled maximum speed. Shared vocabulary removed ambiguity. The integration of radar, plotting, and radio created capability greater than the sum of its parts. Information flowed smoothly from radar operator to plotter to fighter director to pilot. Delays were minimized, errors reduced through cross-checking and standard procedures. The system operated as a human machine, each component performing a specific function in coordination. This level of systematic integration was unusual for 1944. Most military organizations still relied on individual commanders making decisions from local information. The CIC represented a new model: centralized information, distributed execution, coordinated action. The model proved so effective it extended beyond naval aviation. Ground-controlled intercept radar sites adopted similar procedures. Army Air Force bomber formations used comparable coordination. The concept influenced military operations across all services. The performance advantage is clear in comparative statistics. At the Battle of Midway in 1942, American carriers without effective CIC launched fighters against Japanese strikes but achieved poor intercept geometry. Many Japanese bombers reached American carriers,
and USS Yorktown was sunk. Kill ratios favored Americans only because Japanese carriers were vulnerable during landing and refueling. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea in 1944, with fully developed CIC procedures, American carriers destroyed Japanese attacks before they reached bombing range. 0 Japanese bombs hit American ships. The difference was not aircraft or pilot skill alone. The Hellcat was superior but not overwhelmingly so. Training was a factor, but the decisive element was radar-directed fighter control and the CIC. Japanese formations were systematically destroyed regardless of approach, axis, or tactics. Superior information and coordination overcame any advantage in individual aircraft or pilots. The cost-effectiveness of CIC was remarkable. Equipment, sophisticated for 1944, was inexpensive relative to ships and aircraft. A complete radar system cost approximately $100,000. Training a full CIC crew cost instructor and student time, but minimal equipment. Return on investment was extraordinary. At Philippine Sea, 30 American aircraft lost versus 346 Japanese destroyed, an 11-to-1 kill ratio. Without CIC coordination, the ratio could have been even or favored the Japanese. CIC converted parity into overwhelming dominance. No other system delivered a better return on investment. The psychological impact on Japanese pilots was severe. Survivors returned to carriers demoralized, reporting that American defenses were impenetrable. No tactics succeeded. Approaching high or low was detected. Coordinated attacks from multiple directions were intercepted simultaneously. Fatalism appeared in Japanese diaries after June 1944. Some concluded survival was impossible and embraced kamikaze tactics, ensuring their deaths had effect. Suicide attacks beginning October 1944 were partly a response to failures at Philippine Sea. If pilots could not survive long enough to bomb a carrier, they could at least crash into one. Technological hopelessness revealed that Philippine Sea contributed significantly. The Battle of the Philippine Sea stands as one of history's most lopsided victories. Immediate results: 346 Japanese aircraft destroyed versus 30 American lost, speak for themselves. Long-term consequences were profound. Japanese naval aviation never recovered. The strategic bombing campaign against Japan became feasible. Island hopping continued without effective Japanese naval opposition, and systematic coordination through technology was validated. Lessons from Philippine Sea influenced military operations across all domains for the next 80 years. Modern warfare since 1944 has been as much about systems as weapons. The side with better systems usually prevails, regardless of equipment quality. This principle, demonstrated decisively on June 19, 1944, remains central to military strategy today.